Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Speak Plainly podcast, where we speak plainly about things that matter. I am your host, Owl Medicine. Welcome back to another episode. Today's episode on things that matter is going to be about polyvagal theory. I have talked about many aspects of polyvagal theory without ever mentioning polyvagal theory specifically so far in this podcast. We talk about lots of stuff with trauma, nervous system dysregulation and regulation, re-regulation, co-regulation, self-regulation. There's all sorts of things that I've mentioned that are all based on this one scientific theory that kind of flies in the face of what most of us were taught when we were young. I was taught all through my medical training about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and those are the two branches of the autonomic nervous system, or the automated nervous system. Well, in 1995, which is a while ago now, there was a theory put forward by Steven Porges that is now called polyvagal theory. That's what he called it too. That explores and explains how the autonomic system works. It turns out that the reason it's called polyvagal theory is because what Steven Porges learned and realized is that there are multiple branches of the vagus nerve. And what he discovered is each of them have slightly different functions. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the changes to our basic understanding of our autonomic nervous system through the lens of polyvagal theory, which seems a bit strange to say even. It feels strange to me at least, because we know that this is how things work, yet it's not what is taught. But that's why I do this podcast, is to talk about the things that we know to be true that haven't quite made it into the zeitgeist of the global conversation around trauma, around these things that are important. So to help me today with this, I grabbed a flip book from a friend of mine who is in school to become a clinical psychologist, and there is a flip book that I'm in love with this thing. It's great. This flip book does a wonderful job of hitting the highlights and also making sure that the rubber meets the road, so to speak. But I'm going to use this flip book today to move through some questions. We're going to look at what is polyvagal theory, what are the essential elements and the organizing principles behind polyvagal theory. We're going to talk about co-regulation, self-regulation. We're going to talk about neuroception. We're going to talk about the autonomic timeline and the autonomic hierarchy. We're going to talk about their parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. And we're going to look at what is labeled under polyvagal theory as the autonomic ladder. The exploration of the autonomic ladder, I think, will be really useful for people because we're going to talk about blended states. And blended states are really important to understanding polyvagal theory in a practical way and not just a academic way. We're going to talk about social engagement and how those help to modulate our blended states. And we're going to talk about the Vagal Breaking system. So that's the overall arc of what we're going to be looking at today, including a little bit about trauma, because it wouldn't be Speak Plainly without covering how trauma affects the autonomic nervous system. So stick with me to the end, and you will have a wonderful working knowledge of what polyvagal theory is. And it's incredibly powerful because just as I texted a friend earlier today, as I was going through and reviewing all of this stuff, again, I realized that it's really not different from dog training. When we talk about a well-trained or well-behaved dog, specifically behaved, a well-behaved dog, or a dog that's comfortable and enjoys its own life, we basically boil it down to, have they been properly socialized? And turns out human beings aren't much different. So stick with me to the end. We're going to talk about polyvagal theory. By the end of the discussion, you should have some updated information that really help you to understand how your own nervous system works. So what is polyvagal theory? If you look up, like, even interviews with Steven Porges, the guy who invented this, or the guy who discovered the theory or developed the theory, he always winds up taking a big deep breath and being like, oh, how much time do you have? Because it's a very hard thing to encompass. Just like the theory of gravity, it depends on how close you want to look, right? Because for most of us, throwing an apple up in the air and watching it fall to the ground, that happens because of gravity. Things fall toward the center of the earth because of theory of gravity. What goes up must come down. That is a basic fundamental understanding that is good enough for most people. But for those of us with trauma, understanding more of the theory is really, really helpful, in the same way that particle physicists need to know a lot more about gravity than a janitor does. So, just like gravity, polyvagal theory is a theory that explains and describes the way the autonomic nervous system works. It defines the ways that the autonomic nervous system reacts to experiences and regulates responses. It describes the way that the nervous system takes in information and initiates a response to help us safely navigate life. It also outlines a hierarchy of 3 biological pathways of response. That is to say, 3 pre-programmed responses that are innate in our species, in our biology, that happen automatically. And helps, once we know that, it helps to provide a predictable map of when we're going to do what and how we're going to move from one nervous system state to the next. Nervous system states being, in polyvagal theory, the sympathetic, parasympathetic, and dorsal vagal. So, the 3 essential elements of polyvagal theory are context, choice, and connection. And we'll break that down a little bit further very soon. Just hold that in your mind for right now. The 3 essential elements are context, choice, and connection. The 3 organizing principles of polyvagal theory are co-regulation, and specifically co-regulation as a biological imperative. Now, this is a medical theory, and these theories tend to be rather absolute. And they have to be. They have to hold up absolutely under scrutiny, and if they don't, they have to get thrown out. And nobody's been able to throw this out. So when this says a biological imperative, it really means that it's an imperative. It has to happen. So co-regulation is a biological imperative. There is a very important process in here called that Steven Porges describes as neuroception, or detection without awareness. You've heard me harp on meditation a million times, and awareness, and how our focus and attention are the most powerful thing that we have. Neuroception is this concept of detection that our nervous system has, our subconscious detection of our environment without our awareness. And then the last organizing principle is this hierarchy of the 3 predictable pathways of response. There is a ventral vagal, which is our socializing. There is the sympathetic, which is activation. And then there is dorsal vagal, which is inactivation. So basically, polyvagal theory is a breakdown of the autonomic nervous system, which means the automated nervous system. So we're talking about the nervous system, the central nervous system, or the CNS, and that gets broken down into 2 parts, your voluntary and your involuntary. This is just about the involuntary part. So this is talking about the pre-programmed biological responses that help us to survive, because that's all biology is ever concerned about. It's concerned with surviving. And so there are 3 predictable pathways of response: the ventral vagal, the sympathetic, and the dorsal vagal. And the ventral vagal is all about social engagement. Social engagement, from a biological perspective, is largely about co-regulation. Is it safe to connect? The autonomic nervous system sends and searches for cues of safety and danger all of the time. And I've talked in this podcast about these two competing fundamental drives in every one of us, in any biological organism. And that is the authenticity versus attachment war. Well, in this, they talk about the drive to survive and the longing to connect. And they're basically talking about the exact same thing that I was in that episode of the podcast, where we have a drive to survive, a biological imperative, and we have this desire, this need to connect. We already established earlier that co-regulation is a biological imperative through polyvagal theory, and we'll get to why in just a second. But basically, we're constantly searching for safety. That is the main concern of the autonomic nervous system. It's constantly looking and evaluating for context, choice, and connection. And when one of those three things is missing, that's when our body launches us into preparation for protection. So the co-regulation aspect is the connection aspect, because we're a social species, right? So we have to connect with other people in our species in order to be safe. Not even just feel safe, but as a species, there is safety in numbers. And our biology understands that. Our body understands that, because the autonomic nervous system doesn't give any crap about your theory as to why something happens or what you think will happen. The autonomic nervous system learns one way and one way only, and that's through experience. And that experience, if we are unaware of it, is called neuroception. And that's the next main piece in the polyvagal theory, is neuroception, detection without awareness. Neuroception describes the way that the autonomic nervous system takes in information without involving any of the thinking parts, without any of your conscious awareness. Neuroception responds to cues of safety and danger inside the body, outside the body, in the environment, and between people. So when there is a match, because they talk about matches and mismatches in polyvagal theory, a match is when the neuroception answers the question, am I safe or in danger in this moment? The autonomic nervous system then moves into a state that brings energy needed to manage the situation effectively. Now, that's kind of wordy, but basically what they're saying is, in that moment, if there is a neuroceptive match, your nervous system is able to evaluate for those three C's, and if one of them is missing and we start to prepare for action or inaction, that we actually move to whichever action or inaction is going to be the most beneficial in the context. If you're being chased by a bear, then inaction could be really useful, because playing dead could get you to survive. That is the dorsal vagal nerve, the dorsal vagal pathway. And then there is the sympathetic, which is kind of there in the middle, the sympathetic pathway, which is the activation, and the ventral vagal being the social aspect. So neuroception is this completely subconscious evaluation of those three C's. And if there is a match in the neuroceptive awareness, essentially all that means is that you're able to evaluate the context and those three C's and move into the appropriate state to fight, if fighting or fleeing might work, or to become incapacitated, if that is going to be the most successful strategy. That's the fawn freeze part. On a high view level, what polyvagal is separating is, we used to call them the 4 F's of the sympathetic nervous system: the fight, flight, freeze, and sex, or fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and sex. And that's been a fun little joke for a long time. But what we found out is actually that fight and flight and the incapacitation, the freeze, fawn, Those are two different neurological pathways. They're not the same. They have literally a different nerve that innervates different organs in the body. So the autonomic timeline is the next thing to talk about. The autonomic timeline is basically saying that how did our autonomic nervous system get created over time through evolution? And the parasympathetic dorsal vagal is this immobilized, disconnected one that says up, shut down, lower the heart rate, conserve resources, conserve energy, because there's nothing I can do at this moment in time that is going to help me. That is about 500 million years old. And then there is the sympathetic, or the mobilized fight and flight activation. That is 400 million years old. And then the brand new part of this, the uniquely mammalian branch of our autonomic nervous system, is the ventral vagal, which is also parasympathetic. So it's interesting to look at these when you recognize that the safe and socially connected activation is parasympathetic. To be safe and social is rest and digest. And that parasympathetic sits on either side of sympathetic. So this might sound a little bit confusing, but it becomes much more clear when we get into the blended states. But what this is saying is that parasympathetic is both, like there is a parasympathetic activation that is both above sympathetic and below sympathetic as far as like levels of activation. And the reason that this makes sense to me is because as we evolved over time, it makes sense that like if you're a tiny little organism and you then like 500 million years ago, then just holding still, I don't know, for some reason I think of like single cell or like really small organisms that don't really have much for like locomotion. So just being still draws less attention to you, and you might have a good chance of surviving. And then sympathetic is fight or flight. All right, fight to survive or run away to survive. That also makes sense. But that basically leaves us at either, like that leaves our nervous system either immobilized and disconnected, but chilling to some degree with that lower heart rate and all of those things that are associated with the parasympathetic nervous system. Or you're activated in this sympathetic, mobilized fight and flight, and that doesn't sound very nice. It sounds like bipolar disorder or like anxious depression. Whereas if we are properly socialized, like I was talking about with the dogs, then we can activate this new, only 200 million year old ventral vagus nerve, and that is where we are like safe and we feel socially connected. That is where we get health and growth and restoration. We get our individual identity and interactive regulation through social engagements. That's where you get play. When you can combine the parasympathetic ventral vagal with the sympathetic like system of mobilization, fight and flight, when you blend those two, you get play. Most of us know that after trauma, people tend to get stuck in either hyper or hypo functioning. You either overfunction or underfunction. And that's because those are the two basic states of our nervous system, right? We've already covered that. That's the sympathetic response is to over, or the parasympathetic dorsal vagal, which is to immobilize, to hypofunction. We're either going to do too much or not enough. And all that really says is that at the time of your trauma, whatever strategy, or what at the time of your trauma or the highest concentration of your traumas, whatever strategy your body launched, because you didn't choose any of these, your body does this for you. It makes these decisions through that concept we talked about of neuroception. Through the detection of the environment underneath your conscious awareness, your body chooses how to respond in a given situation. And as a child, you can't really fight or run away from your parents because they're bigger than you and you need them. So you're forced into inactivation. You wind up being thrown into this early evolutionary circuit, the dorsal vagal, which is about withdraw and shut down and collapse. That's when we become foggy and numb and we go through the motions, but without any awareness. This is when we feel disconnected from ourselves and from other people and the world. We feel lost and invisible and abandoned, and we disappear into a state of not knowing, not feeling, not being. Those are the hypofunction people, and the reason that they're a hypofunction person is because that is the strategy that served them best in their experience. Because like I said, the autonomic nervous system doesn't give a crap about what you think. It gives a crap about what you experience. If your developmental trauma was when you were young enough that you couldn't fight or fly, usually this immobilization is what we have to deal with. And I think that's why people have such a hard time when I ask them point blank, like, what do you want? Because they've never been asked these questions before. And when that happens and people feel on the spot or under attack, that they get pulled out of this ventral vagal social engagement parasympathetic mode and get thrown into this sympathetic response. And when they get activated that way, if the way that they normally have survived uncomfortable levels of sympathetic activation is to shut down, that's when people, they just don't know. They have no idea. And they don't know what they think. They don't know what they feel. And it's really just a function of what was the context in which you experienced your trauma and what strategy of the two, fight, flight, or freeze, fawn, sympathetic activation or parasympathetic immobilization was more effective at the time. One of the biggest pieces of polyvagal theory is talking about the social engagement system, because neuroception is the constant evaluation of the environment, right? And that determines our nervous system state. And what polyvagal is really getting at is, at its heart, is that the state of the nervous system determines pretty much everything. It determines everything about how we respond, how we feel, what we think, what we feel. Is all determined by neuroception, essentially. And the way that we counterbalance that is through this ventral vagal system. And what's really cool about this is the ventral vagal has innervations deep in the brain that reach out like fingers into the face to control the facial expression muscles, and down into the heart, where it actually leads directly to the SA node, the sinoatrial node. And that is the node that is in charge of firing in order to get your heart to beat at the appropriate beats per minute as chosen to be appropriate by your autonomic nervous system. This social engagement system, this nerve bundle, the set of nerve bundles that innervate the face, parts of the brain, that do facial expression, eyelids, middle ear. It's in charge of mastication, ingestion, and sucking. It's in charge of the larynx and the pharynx, swallowing and breathing, and it controls head turn and tilt. And what it's doing is the social engagement system, because we're a social species, is how we modulate our feeling of safety. When other people are around, we can watch their faces and choose whether or not, and detect whether or not they're in fear, and then choose to be in fear or not with that information. Because remember, we're constantly evaluating for those 3 C's: context, choice, and connection. Because the context is, all of this is about safety, because it's the autonomic nervous system. Am I safe or am I under threat? And the context informs us of that. The choice is about choosing our response. Do we fight? Do we fly? Do we immobilize? Or do we somehow try to re-regulate through the social engagement system? And that's what the ventral vagus is for. It's this uniquely mammalian engagement system, because Before mammals, there were just reptiles. And reptiles aren't exactly like warm and fuzzy mommies and daddies. Snakes and turtles don't have long childhood rearing things. They just dump their eggs and like figure it out. And if you don't, you don't. But mammals have developed a much longer child rearing phase, and we have maintained our safety and been able to take over the entire planet due to our highly adaptable social engagement system. We have to learn whether or not somebody is trustworthy so we can trust them with our children, around our children, or with our plans, our food. We have to be able to tell whether or not we can trust someone. And all the snakes kind of look the same, but mammals have very expressive faces. And it seems like this may have developed as a way for us to be able to learn to trust each other. Because when we look at someone's face, we can actually detect, because of that nervous system connection, that ventral vagus nerve that connects the face and the brainstem and the heart rate, we're able to look at someone's face and know whether they are in danger or whether they are at peace. This is what therapy is. This is like your therapist is being paid to maintain their own regulation no matter what you tell them. Because them maintaining their own regulation is going to help you re-regulate or stay regulated while talking about something that is dysregulating. And they say that's how you solve trauma, is you take a terrible story and you are able to retell it without all of the emotional turmoil. And that means the actual emotional turmoil, not convincing yourself that it doesn't bother you, but that you've told it so many times, or told it enough times at least, that you've come to terms with as many of the ripple effects as you can. This social engagement system is what all therapists are relying on to help you stay regulated. Because, like we said, this social engagement system is the ventral vagus. And when you get the ventral vagal plus the sympathetic activation, that's play. Right? So the ventral vagal being parasympathetic and the sympathetic being sympathetic, when you can combine both of those, you're in play. That's also where sex lies. Because for men, the erection itself is a parasympathetic, like ventral vagal thing. And ejaculation or as part of the sympathetic response. So sex is this beautiful interplay between the ventral vagal and the sympathetic activation. And the most difficult part, this is where we're into blended states. Play is a blended state. Safety and stillness, too, is a blended state. And it's probably the most complicated because stillness is, well, it's a challenge because it's to become still without being pulled into the dorsal vagal shutdown. And what's happened, like when we're looking at all of these, we have the three states, right? The ventral vagal, the sympathetic, and the dorsal vagal. And two of those three are parasympathetic. But what happens is most of us, under stress, like we said, are either hypofunctioning, dorsal vagal, or hyperfunctioning, sympathetic. And so when we go to do stillness, if immobilization has been your primary technique for survival, it might be very easy for you to just kind of dissociate, to become numb, to separate yourself. And when you try to move into the stillness, instead of this like woo way, doing nothing is doing something and doing something is doing nothing if you do it all right. That's this stillness and this safety in this stillness is very woo way to me. And it's complicated because depending on how much trauma, especially you've had in your life, you're really going to want to get pulled into this dorsal vagal, especially if your trauma is complex. So stillness is a complicated concept in polyvagal theory, but is extremely, extremely important. Which brings us to the vagal break, or the breaking system. of the body, because it's the parasympathetic, right? So the vagal brake or braking system is about increasing and decreasing the heart rate, is like one of the main physiological pieces to it, but it brings mobilization without a move into sympathetic fight or flight survival responses. And it also supports the ability to calm down when in action. Once you're in an activated state, the vagal braking system allows you to calm down without shutting down. We have the sympathetic cardiac nerves, which increase heart rate and force contraction. And then we have the parasympathetic vagus nerve that connects directly to the heart to help slow things down. And so through its sympathetic and parasympathetic activations, is in charge of helping us move through what they call the ladder, which is just the hierarchy of these three systems. So when all of the systems are online, the ventral vagal oversees the systems, meaning the social engagement activation thing, this connection between the face, the brain, and the heart that is uniquely mammalian. That is in charge of all of the systems. When all systems are go, we're good. We can move through, like, navigating the world with safety and flexibility. We can connect, we can see possibilities and explore other options for any problems that we have. We can create. This is where creativity is. This is that parasympathetic, but it's still active, right? The sympathetic is helping to regulate blood flow and heart rate, making sure it's appropriate for our context. It mobilizes us in play, and it helps us to move with passion. That's the sympathetic nervous system. We talked about it's both play and sex. And then there is the parasympathetic nervous system, or the dorsal vagus, which is our rest, digest, and restore. And when all systems are online, that's what happens. We are resting and digesting and restoring. That's important, this rest, digest, and restore, because that's not quite the same as when it's the only thing online. When it's the only thing online, when we get into that hypo-functioning state and the dorsal vagal system is the one that's in charge, that's when we zone out, shut down, disassociate, disappear, we freeze, we collapse, we suffer with digestive issues. When just that shutdown is activated, when just the dorsal vagal is activated, we shut down. And so all of these systems are meant to work together. We have this kind of concept, especially those of us trained in this, we have this concept of we bounce from one to the next, and really one of the genius things within polyvagal theory is expressing how these all work together as like a symphony to allow us to move through life. Because when the sympathetic nervous system takes over, we lose the ventral, because that's the newest, right? When we're moving through life, we're chilling. Hopefully most of the time we've got like all systems online, we're good. Something stressful happens and it stimulates our sympathetic activation. And if that happens and our ventral vagal is shut down, then who's in charge is the sympathetic nervous system takes over. That's when we get a sense of unease, we lose our cognitive abilities, and we avoid people. We move totally out of social engagement. We want to stay as far away from people as we can. We are mobilized for fight or flight. We might get into like the deer headlights freeze thing, and we will definitely feel the effects of cortisol, adrenaline, and the other corticosteroids that are launched as a part of this stress response by the sympathetic nervous system. Now, we've talked a little bit about trauma, but I want to break it down a little bit more. When we talk about the impacts of trauma as polyvagal theory, what we're really talking about is the autonomic impacts of trauma, that's not what we usually think about when we're talking about trauma. It's usually big T traumas, and we think about flashbacks, and we think about being pulled out of our current time and place, and that's not exactly what we're talking about here. We're talking especially about developmental trauma, chronic stress adaptation. I love these different definitions for things. I've talked about Gabor Mate's definition quite often for what trauma is, and Steven Porges says that trauma is a chronic disruption of connection. Now, we talked about how the autonomic nervous system is constantly seeking for those 3 C's, connection being a huge one, because that connection, social connection, that is our primary driver for how we engage with the world, and that's the only of the 3 systems that can have all 3 systems online together. If we're primary sympathetic or primary dorsal vagal, we're only going to have one of those 2, and we're going to be stuck in hyperfunctioning or hypofunctioning. We're going to be shut down, or we're going to be anxious. We're going to be depressed, or we're going to be anxious. The ventral vagal, this social aspect, is always seeking for this sense of safety, because that's what the autonomic system is based on. And it seeks it through connection, especially in developmental trauma, because our connection with our parents is life-saving. But when co-regulation, which is supposed to happen with our parents, is unavailable, if it's especially often unavailable, unpredictable, or unsafe, that causes trauma, because we're not able to move into this restore and developing state. When self-regulation may not be inadequate or successful, that can create trauma. And self-regulation, as you've heard me say probably, I find to be a Band-Aid. We are designed as a species to co-regulate. It's just way faster. We're way better at it. We have an entire branch of our nervous system, our automatic nervous system, that's dedicated to co-regulation. And when we're children, we simply can't self-regulate in hardly any kind of way. Not temperature, not emotional, not any kind of way. We need another nervous system that we can then mirror and mimic. And that's how we learn how to manipulate our own states and to regulate. When opportunities to build autonomic circuits of connection are interrupted, that can also be traumatic to a nervous system. When adaptive survival responses override social engagement, that too is a type of trauma. This is really important to me, because what it's saying here is adaptive survival responses override social engagement, which means whatever situation that you went through, your nervous system's need to survive it and its success, presumably, in surviving it, caused a programming of your nervous system that launching into either immobilization or mobilization is more important than social engagement, because it's what saved you. That trains a person that they either always need to fight or they need to shut down in order to get through anything hard. Hey, raise his hand not so sheepishly. That would be me. I've joked for years about how I didn't really have an immobilization response. I had fight, and fuck you. Now I'm a little bit better at that, but that's kind of where that comes from. This adaptive survival responses override social engagement. And when that happens, patterns of protection replace patterns of connection, meaning that, just like I said with the adaptive survival responses, that survival response, whether it's mobilized or immobilized, becomes the pattern that is habituated rather than connection, which creates a whole group of people in the world who are like, I don't need nobody but me. That's hyper-independence. That is a sign of the trauma, and this is the explanation through the lens of polyvagal theory. And so trauma gets us stuck in either sympathetic activation or dorsal vagal activation. And that's no fun for anybody. And what we have to do is figure out ways to get us connected again, because we can only have this combination of sympathetic and parasympathetic when our social engagement stuff is turned on. Meaning, Social engagement needs to be your number one priority for regulation. And that doesn't mean you need to go that doesn't mean you need to go to a party, but it does mean that you need to have someone somewhere that you can reach out to that can help you co-regulate, whether that's a therapist or a best friend or a dog or something, because trauma locks us into this hyper or hypo-activated state. And really, what we need to do from here is figure out what our story is and what our states are. How do we know when we are in a sympathetic state? How do we know when we are in a social, well-regulated state? And how do we know when we are in a dorsal vagal or immobilized state? And one of the ways that you can tell that is by looking at the story that you have in your head. Because, like we said, this neuroception concept is your body is detecting things all the time, everywhere, to determine your levels of safety. And if your story is one of connection, where you are connected, you're collaborating, you're cooperative, you have self-compassion, compassion for the others, and you're curious about the world and your own place in it, that is a story of connection, and that is the ventral vagal regulation. That's this social engagement for mammals. Then if you're in a story of driven to compete, you move into judgment, you're critical of others, and you feel like you have to be better than everyone else, or you got to go get something, that makes sense. It's a story of protection. And that is a sympathetic activation, sympathetic mobilization. Whereas a story of loss of hope, the self-critical story, the story of comparison upward, always looking at people doing better than you, going, I'm never going to measure up, I'm never going to be as good, I'm never going to blah, blah, blah. That is a story of disconnection. That's a story of immobilization. That is the dorsal vagal activation, or dorsal vagal collapse, if you'd like to call it that. And so what I want everybody to do is I really want everybody to figure out what your personal profile is for these three states, for your socialized, your sympathetic, and your dorsal vagal. When you're in the safe, well-connected space, there's a couple of questions that are going to be the same in each of these. We're going to have two questions. It says, I am and the world is. And you're going to answer those two questions, I am, ... the world is, ... for ventral vagal, for the sympathetic, and for the dorsal vagal. So when you are in the ventral vagal, safe and connected state, how do you feel about yourself? Think about a time when you were happy with friends, just chilling. You're like, I am what? And the world is what? I am comfortable. I am at peace. I am what? And the world is a beautiful place. The world is, what is the world to you when you are engaged in good, safe social interaction? And then do the same thing for a sympathetic. When you are activated, when you're in that fight or flight state, what do you see yourself as? And what do you see the world as? And do the same thing for your dorsal vagal. When you are immobilized, I am, for me, worthless. When I wind up in that totally inactivated state, I am worthless, and the world is a dark, cold, cruel place. Whereas when I'm in an activated state, the world is full of shit, and I am here to fix it. And that's great. Like that's a good little motto or whatever for me. But I know that that's not actually true, even though as a fight and fuck you kind of person, that is I like sympathetic activation. As an ADHD person, I need more desire. I need more dopamine in my system for my brain to function the way it's supposed to function. So I like being a little overstimulated. I work better that way, and I feel good about working better. So figure out what these are for you. When you're safe and connected, what is this I am statement? When you are activated in a fight or flight kind of way, what is the I am statement for that? When you're a fighter, or when you're fleeing, what is that? And the same thing for when you're shutting down. when you're in this dorsal vagal? What is your I am statement? And what is the world like to you? Now, once you have those, you can pause it or whatever, write those down. This is the last one. I want you to do the same thing again with each of these three branches, the ventral vagal, the sympathetic, and the dorsal vagal. I want you to write down, and we'll start with triggers. What are some triggers that you have that you know send you into immobilized, collapsed dorsal vagal activation? What is it that you know will just shut you down? What is a trigger for that? And then do the same thing for what are triggers that launch you into this sympathetic fight, flight, freeze, this fight and flight response. What do you know mobilizes you into wanting to fight? Any sense of unfairness or injustice automatically launches me into this fight or flight thing because of associations I have with it from my own childhood. I know that sends me into wanting to fight people or things. Most importantly, beyond your triggers, because I'm sure you know what shuts you down. I'm sure you know what pisses you off. And that's really what I'm asking here. What shuts you down, dorsal vagal? What pisses you off, sympathetic? But the thing I would really like you to focus on is, what are your glimmers of hope? What are the things that allow you to recognize that you are feeling safe and connected? What little thoughts do you have that allow you to that can allow you to recognize when you're feeling safe? What are the physical sensations that you have that allow you to know when you're feeling safe? For me, it's abdominal tension. It's a big one. When my abdominal tension goes away, I know I'm feeling a lot safer. I have a lot of resting abdominal tension that causes me to burp, and I have just all kinds of weird issues like that. So for me, I know that I'm feeling safe when those symptoms go away. I know I'm feeling safe when I'm laughing spontaneously. Those are glimmers for me. What are your glimmers? Because like I said, you know what pisses you off. You know what shuts you down. But the way that we regulate these things is through our glimmers of hope, because they activate that ventral vagal. And then that allows us to be in a state in which we can move smoothly from activated to inactivated. Or if we were talking about brain states, it would be the default mode network versus the task-focused network. Sympathetic is this task-focused network, and the ventral vagal are the default mode network. So the very, very last step is regulating your resources, is what they call it in polyvagal theory. And all you're doing is you've already written down what pisses you off and what shuts you down. Now what I want you to write out is in the same 3 rows here. You can do the ventral vagal, you're safe and connected. What helps you stay here? What can help you that you know, help you on your own that you can do that allows you to stay in this feeling of safe connectedness? And then I want you to do the same thing, but write about what you can do with others to feel and maintain safety and connection. For me, my default go-to when I start to feel dysregulated is to disconnect from as many sensory inputs as I can. If there's a bunch of noise or people or whatever, I'll just try to leave that. And if that doesn't work, which usually doesn't, I put in headphones. I'm a big fan of dealing with things like a teenager. And for me, the headphones is a really, really great way, because the music is something that I can do on my own that has a feeling of safety. I have years and years of conditioning of playing music is a very safe thing for me. It feels good. It's enjoyable. It's a thing that I do that's social. When I'm around other people, I want to play music more, especially when they're playing music. It has lots of positive associations for me. So the thing I know I can do on my own is music related, either play music or listen to music, and that helps me to stay feeling safe and connected. Things I do with other people, also music. My life really revolves around this. But what helps me to, other than music, is having deep conversations with friends, having high-minded philosophical conversations with friends. I mean, even just talking shit sometimes with friends. I don't do that as much as I used to, but connecting with people in whatever way you connect with people, figure what is that? What is that way that you can connect with other people that allows you to feel safe? For me, it's music or deep, long conversations that are obnoxious for most other people. What is it for you? Look at this. Look at sympathetic and dorsal vagal as well, and look at what moves you out of sympathetic. And there's a whole lot of options here. I thought about going and grabbing my dialectical behavioral therapy book, because they have page after page after page of ideas as to what you can do when you're feeling overly activated, that sympathetic activation, or you're feeling underactivated. What moves you out of there? What moves you out of disconnection? Maybe something that you can do on your own to get you out of this mobilized sympathetic response. I will literally walk. The forward movement of walking, that like there's something about things moving through your periphery, going from in front of you to behind you, that soothes the amygdala, which is the threat response center. And as we move away from stuff and that chills out, that calms down the sympathetic response. So that's something that I know that is scientifically proven to help move us out of a sympathetic or mobilized thing. Movement is perfect. Movement is the way to do it, if you ask me. You can do yoga, you can go on a walk, you can do that alone, or you can do it with others, because this regulating resources is about things that you can do on your own and things that you can do with others to either help you stay in a safe and connected social engagement, or to move you out of the sympathetic being the dominant mode, or the dorsal vagal immobilization being the dominant mode. And for me, I'm sure there's probably better ways of doing this, but with the dorsal vagal, because I'm kind of a sympathetic activation person on my own, if I do and when I do wind up in a immobilized thing, I just sleep. I don't know if that's good or not. I don't know if it's helpful or not, but it works for me, because I'll get immobilized and I'll get depressed, and then I'll just be like, tomorrow's another day. Sleep fixes a lot. And it is one of the neurological doors that our consciousness uses to help us escape the inescapable. Sleep is a haven in that way, for me especially. I will often rely on sleep to get me out of that inactivated mode, because if I feel immobilized that way and like I'm stressed, there's something gone really wrong, because normally I'm like, I'm up for the challenge and I'll find a way. And I'll usually try to get friends to help me figure out how to navigate a challenge. And that allows me to stay activated in this sympathetic activation, but also in the social engagement thing where I can be creative about my solutions. So anyway, this is the regulating resources map. What can you do on your own, and what can you do with others that either helps you stay in the safe and connected social engagement system, or to move you out of the fight or flight system, or move out of the freeze and fawn system. So, in conclusion, polyvagal theory was a theory developed by Steven Porges that became official in 1995 and has fundamentally changed the way that we think about the nervous system and the inputs and outputs of it. We used to think there was just like input and output, but now we know that there is a third very important piece. There is input, the state of the nervous system itself, and then the output, and how the state of the nervous system at any given moment is pretty much guaranteed to determine the output, no matter what the input is. And neuroception is the way that we determine whether we are safe or not in the present. We have the parasympathetic activation in safety and socialization. We have sympathetic activation, which is seeking safety through action. And then we have dorsovagal safety, which is safety through immobilization. The autonomic system is only concerned with one thing, am I safe or not? That's all it's based on. Everything automated in our body is not based on thriving. It is based on surviving. So it is about, am I safe enough to survive, and what strategy can I launch in this context that is most likely to get me to survive again? And that's basically the whole upfront of polyvagal theory. There are three branches: the ventral, sympathetic, and the dorsal. They developed at different times. Dorsal's the oldest. It's incapacitation. The sympathetic is the next oldest. It's fight and flight. And the ventral is the newest. And it is also parasympathetic. And they're not independent states. It's not like you turn one on and the next one off. That happens, but that's usually a pathology of some sort, left over from trauma or something neurologic. What's intended to be the way that it functions is through a well-regulated nervous system, we are easily able to move back and forth between parasympathetic and sympathetic activation of both the ventral vagal and the dorsal vagal and the middle, which is the sympathetic. And when we do all of that, we move through blended states and we have all the fun, because the blended states are where we get both play and sex, through blending the parasympathetic ventral and the sympathetic nervous system. So now you have some homework to do. Hopefully you've already done it, but think about that. Think about your personal profile of, how do you know when you are feeling safe? How do you know when you are feeling activated or you are feeling immobilized? If you don't know what you're doing, you don't know what you're thinking, you're probably immobilized. If you do, and everything's wrong with the world, then you're probably in sympathetic. And if you're feeling fine and cozy and it's like it could be and it could not be and all that's fine too, you're probably in a well-socialized ventral vagal state. And that's the place that we all want to be. We all basically want to be well-socialized little puppies. That's how we live the most rewarding life that we can. That allows our nervous system to do its job with this neuroception and evaluate the environment that we are in for safety, and then determine appropriately whether we need to activate or inactivate, immobilize, in order to maintain or attain safety if we are not safe. Because some situations you need to fight, some situations you need to run away, and some situations you need to play dead. In some situations, you just need to tell somebody how wonderful and beautiful that they are. All of these are perfectly acceptable biological responses to a lack of safety, a threat to our safety. There is no judgment on which one it is that you do most often. That's determined upon kind of how old you are and what the situation was that you were in at the time when you first were exposed to chronic stress or a traumatic situation or traumatic environment. So there's polyvagal theory. It's not just sympathetic and parasympathetic, although those words do still apply. There is very importantly a uniquely mammalian branch to the vagus nerve, polyvagal, many vaguses, vagus meaning wanderer. It is one big old nerve that wanders the entire body and innervates all of our organs. And it's got these three branches, an old, a medium, and a brand new. And the brand new is here for mammals, so we can decide whether or not someone is trustworthy, so we can all communicate. We can build villages and cities and worlds together. We can let strangers watch our children and all of that, because we have this ventral nervous system that connects our face to our brain and our heart and allows us to evaluate another person's state in a given moment. And I think that's really cool. So that is the fundamental aspects of polyvagal theory. There is so much more to this, but I wanted to just try to hit the highlights. I hope that this was informative for you, because polyvagal theory is the foundation of most good therapy nowadays. This amazing flip book I have is Polyvagal Flip Chart, Understanding the Science of Safety. Thank you, Jenny, for letting me borrow this. It is written by Deb Dana, author of Polyvagal Theory in Therapy. And it's wonderful because it actually is set up to be a flip book on a desk, at a therapist's office, because Jenny's training to be a therapist. And it's got pictures and they're laminated. They got little charts so you can write stuff down. And it's got everything showing on one side for the client, and it's got a little bit more detailed information on the back side for the therapist. So thank you for letting me use this book, Jenny. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions about polyvagal theory, just shoot me a message. It has become a fundamental part of the way I understand the world, trauma, and the nervous system, because it's just true, whether we are taught it regularly or not. This is now the most updated, scientifically validated understanding of how the autonomic nervous system works in human beings. If you've made it this far in the podcast, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Like I said, I hope you got something out of this. If you enjoy the podcast, consider becoming a Patreon member or buy me a coffee. All the links are down below. Again, this is Polyvagal Theory, invented by Steven Porges. And remember, everybody, stay curious and stay uncomfortable.
Good.